So these are just some of the names of types of line that you might use. If you've taken a drawing class, you'll be really familiar with those. Um, all lines are actual unless they are implied. So most lines you don't really even say actual because they're just some type of line, but you can also have what's called implied line, is something you might not normally think of. So one of the most basic drawing with line is contour line, and that is what often people call an outline, where it's the main drawing around the main edges of form and any major changes in the form. But it doesn't have a lot of detail. It's more simplified. So here's another example in a cartoon. Cartoons often use contour line outlines. So that is just going over the main contours of the object. So this is another example in white on black paper using contour line. Again, they're not filling in things like textures or shading. It's really just the basic outlines of form. So when you get more detailed with line, you can be starting to create value and texture through line, or what we call linear value. So how are they changing the lines to create the idea of midtones or shadows? Matthew, what do you notice?
Can you repeat the question, please?
How are they achieving the idea of midtones or shadows? What are they doing to the lines? How are they changing them?
From what I can tell from here, let me zoom in. Some of them are a bit more faded, while
well, they're using if you're using all the same type of ink pen, then you can't exactly fade it. So how else do you think that what do you think they're changing?
Let me see.
Because say that was all done with the same size pen, what you're calling faded really is probably just like a thinner line.
Yeah, because I noticed like towards the right of this drawing, what looks like almost like a piece of glass or a magnifying glass looking thing.
Yeah.
You see a lot of really like small repeated lines, and then you see a couple of medium-sized ones that are slightly curved.
Okay, so they're doing different lengths of lines. So that's a good observation. These are what we call hatching marks. So they're using different lengths of lines, but also how close together they are. Thank you, Matthew. So how dense the lines create midtones or shadows. So they might have used like a gray pen or pencil in combination with the ink to get kind of lighter tones. But if this was all done with the same ink pen, then it might have more to do with how close together those lines are to create the idea of value. So closer together would create darker shadows. So line can be manipulated to really create the idea of what we call value. Line can also be used a lot more expressively. So expressive line is not realistic. It instead is used in a stylized manner in order to, create a certain mood or expression. So how does this change your feeling of like a portrait of the person? How does this make it different than if they were using like realistic mark making? Chantal, you were going to say something earlier.
I was talking about something else, but for this, because I remember we did this in like a visual journal assignment in your other class in drawing. So with this, I think it's the actual like making the lines more condensed, and this just scribbled lines instead of actual like thought out. I mean, they're still thought out, but it's more like, what's this called? squab. We did
Oh,
it.
like scumbling?
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
you're thinking of
scumbling.
like scumbling in drawing class. So how do you feel like, why do you feel like the artist would do that instead of draw realistically? Like, what do you think that adds to the piece?
I think it gives it more character, and it makes it more unique and less realistic, but also they look very real. So it's
Right. Yeah, there's still realism, but there's also expressionism added with that. Okay, thank you, Chantal. Um, I'm gonna call on different people just so we hear more voices. So you're not just listening to me drone on. So one line that we might not have really gone over is what we call implied line. So in that case, your mind understands that there's a line there because you're kind of connecting the dots, so to speak, but it's not a continuous, solid, or actual line. So in these drawings, the outer two, we have both actual and implied lines. So the solid lines, like in the background, are actual lines, but then the edge of this circle is actually an implied edge that is formed by the points of the actual lines. So there is what we would call an implied line. A dashed or dotted line can also be an implied line. So the edge of this S on the right here is an implied edge that, that's actually a negative space between other lines, but we understand that the shape is there because of the points of all the other lines. So they didn't even have to draw an outline for that S, to make us see it there. They could do it with the space between the other lines. So line can have different thicknesses and thinness in what we call line weight. So that has to do with how thick or thin it is. So you could change your pen size, or you could turn it more on its side to get a thicker line. Or you can also start to build up value with these types of lines like dots, mark making, lots of short marks like hatching, or overlapping it to create cross hatching. So those were examples of some of the things artists use to create value with line, in addition to line weight. So here's an example of stippling. So dots are still part of that line family that some of you might have used in your Zentangles, or you might not have, but stippling is also something that people often forget about when we think about lines, because they're basically a line that hasn't extended yet. It's just the point. Cross hatching is something that in drawing class you would probably use to create linear value, where you're building up the lines on top of each other, and how much they spread out or come close together creates different values. So it's almost like you're creating a web on the object you're creating, and how tightly those lines get together create more shadows, and how much you space them out creates highlights. So things like hatching and cross hatching can be very fine. So this is actually a drawing in ballpoint pen by an Asian artist. And, you pretty much have to really zoom in to even see those lines, because from afar, like if you're looking at a small screen, this would look like tonal value as if they shaded it with pencil, but that's all made up of lines. And they're pretty large drawings as well. So that is partly why, looking at it, you really have to see it up close. So line is just one way that you can create texture.